Welcome, everyone. We are going to get started now. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to the people here live. Thank you to the people that'll be watching this later, because I know many of you will be, maybe both, to learn and absorb as much as you can. We all know immigration has been at the forefront for a long time, but especially recently. And 2024, an election year, is only going to bring that more to the forefront. So this panel is really, really important. We're going to be sharing so much about what's upcoming in immigration this year, what to look for, as well as share learnings, resources, takeaways. So I really feel strongly that you're all going to get a lot out of this event. Bit of housekeeping. We have, okay, as I just said, we have a chat box and a Q&A box. If you only see one, no problem. But the bottom line is, along the way or at the end, please place your questions for our moderator and panelists in the Q&A box. And we have a set time at the end to make sure to get to as many of your questions as possible. So really feel free to utilize that. And then I'd like to also say, okay, I mentioned about the chat box. Our agenda is here. I'm super excited about this event. Like I said, again, welcome. We're going to have 3 panelists presenting. We're going to speak with a wonderful person from the ACLU, Human Rights First, and then Immigrant ARC. Then we will follow up with a Q&A with panelists. And then finally, some resources, call to action, contact information for all of you to have at the end. And Max, if you don't mind just moving the slide forward to one more page, please. Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to take this opportunity. I'm going to turn everything over to our incredible moderator, Julia McDonald Nieto Del Rio from Documented. And if you're not familiar with Documented yet, I really think you should. She's going to tell us a little bit more about it. But Documented is a nonprofit news source that's solely devoted to immigrants, immigration, and the policies affecting them. So again, a really, really powerful resource. And I know that we're really excited to hear from Julia. So Julia, I'm going to pass it over to you. You can introduce the panelists, chat about Documented, and we will get moving.
Thank you so much, Leanne. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Julia McDonald Nieto del Rio. I'm an immigration reporter at Documented. We're a nonprofit newsroom, as Leanne said, dedicated to covering New York City's immigrants, policies that affect them. And personally, I have been covering asylum seekers coming to the city for about 1.5 to 2 years now, since the spring of 2021. And I'm really excited for this panel today and to hear from our wonderful panelists. So each panelist will take some time to provide an overview of their current work relating to migrants and asylum seekers, the immigration system as a whole, as well as some overview and context from the border situation right now. So first, we'll start with Anu Joshi, who is the National Campaigns Director for Immigration at the ACLU. Then we'll move to have Robin Barnard, who's the Senior Director for Refugee Advocacy at Human Rights First. And we'll end with Oriana Sholovitz Rosado, who's a Policy and Advocacy Strategist at Immigrant ARC. So first, Anu from the ACLU will give us some key historical context about what immigration policy has looked like over the last 2 decades or so. We'll look next at what is currently happening at the border, which Robin from Human Rights First will guide us through. And lastly, we'll focus on a local view of New York efforts and efforts to respond to the needs of asylum seekers with Oriana from Immigrant ARC. So we'll have a little bit of everything here today, and we'll make sure to leave enough time for your questions at the end as well. So I'll pass it to Anu from the ACLU, who will give us an overview of the historical context of immigration policy and agencies over the past 2 decades, including some key moments in immigration policy since 2001, including the DREAM Act, the creation of DHS, DACA, national immigration changes during the Trump administration, and other important topics. Thank you so much, Anu. I'll pass it to you.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. Welcome. So I'm Anu Joshi, and I'm the National Campaigns Director at the American Civil Liberties Union. My pronouns are she and her. And I've been at the ACLU for a couple of years now. And as you probably know, the ACLU does a combination of litigation and legal advocacy, as well as political advocacy and organizing. And we have 53 affiliates across the country in every state, DC and Puerto Rico. So if we could go to the next slide, please, one more. There we go. So I'm going to just talk a little bit. I'm going to try to condense 20 years of immigration and border politics into about 8 minutes. So we'll see how that goes, but happy to answer questions, of course, or provide more detail as we move through this presentation. But I wanted to start in 2001. So you all probably remember that George H.W. Bush came into office in 2001, was the governor of Texas, and really came into office after having run a campaign where he talked a lot about immigration and the need for immigration reform. He had a very good relationship with the then president of Mexico, Vicente Fox. And within his first, 6 months in office, had already laid out a vision, his vision for what immigration reform could and should look like to pass through Congress. And actually, in the summer of 2001, hosted the president of Mexico and a bipartisan group of members of Congress for a summit to talk through what this bipartisan legislation could look like, what a path forward on immigration reform could look like. That was the same year also that we had the original introduction of the DREAM Act. I'm sure by now folks have probably heard of the DREAM Act and its many iterations, but two senators, Democrat Senator Dick Durbin, who's still in the Senate from Illinois, and Republican Orrin Hatch from Utah, who retired a few years ago, got together and introduced this legislation that would allow many undocumented immigrants who came to the United States as children to be able to adjust their status, basically apply for a green card and eventual citizenship. They actually just, as an interesting side note, had the first hearing on the DREAM Act in the beginning of September 2001. And there was a lot of momentum. But as you can imagine, the events of 9/11 dramatically reframed our country's approach to immigration and the border and made any kind of bipartisan legislation impossible for the following many years. What we did see is, if we jump a couple years ahead to 2003, is a real rethinking of the country's approach to immigration and, importantly, to our southern border. And that really culminated in the creation of a mammoth agency called the Department of Homeland Security. So it's important to know that before 2003, the different elements of immigration and immigration enforcement were not all housed in one agency, and they were not all underneath the same secretary. And so, with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, it brought together, I think over 55 different components, and it really made national security a cornerstone of our immigration and border policy in a way that it had not been before. And we've seen, unfortunately, the lasting impacts of that mindset shift and that approach, that change in approach, even till today. In 2007, 2008, in the waning years of President Bush's second term, there was, again, a bipartisan effort to pass immigration reform, led by Senator Kennedy from Massachusetts on the Democratic side and Senator John McCain from Arizona on the Republican side. And you might remember that Senator McCain was gearing up and then was running for the presidency to succeed President Bush in 2007 in the primary and then 2008 in the election. The Senate had a deal that a small group of bipartisan senators reached. President at the time, Senator Barack Obama, at the time, Senator Joe Biden were both in the Senate. And ultimately, the Senate failed to be able to get the 60 votes it needed to get that compromise legislation out of the Senate. And that was because of a mix of both Democrats, including President Obama, and Republicans voting no on that bipartisan bill. And so that 2-year effort really died in 2008. In 2008, we saw President Obama sweep into the White House with a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. So Democrats had 60 senators and a huge majority in the House. Nancy Pelosi became the Speaker. And in 2010, the DREAM Act was revived. Senator Durbin had never stopped fighting for the DREAM Act. He reintroduced it in every Congress. And in 2010, during the lame duck session, after an election in which Republicans had taken back the Senate and the House, the then leader of the Senate put the DREAM Act on the floor. It had already passed the Democratic-controlled House. And unfortunately, it failed to get the 60 votes it needed to pass the Senate. And I'll just note it got 55 yes votes, and 5 Democrats at the time voted no on the DREAM Act. That was it was at the same day that the Senate did successfully pass the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which got the 60 votes that it needed. So if you're thinking about, where we are in terms of how issues have changed over the course of the years, I think it's important to put this in historical context as it relates to other progressive issues that, our country has made strides in. So in 2010, the DREAM Act failed, and Republicans took control of the House. And so if we go to the next slide, we did not see a lot of action in Congress over the next 2 years on the issues of immigration and border. Eventually, in 2012, we were now 2 years into President Obama's second term. At that point, President Obama had deported more people than any other president in history, and had not passed, no meaningful reforms had been passed to put folks on a road to citizenship or legalization. And so you started to see in the beginning months of 2012, as President Obama was gearing up for his re-election campaign, some really incredible organizing, activism from immigrant youth and from, immigrant activists across the country. Really bravely coming out and sharing their stories, coming out of the shadows, and talking about the impact of these failed deportation policies on their families and on their lives. And under that intense pressure, President Obama on June 15th, 2012, announced the creation of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals Program, or DACA. Now, this is a program that would allow many immigrant youth who were brought into the country under the age of 16 to be able to apply for deferred action, which would grant them temporary protection from deportation and a work permit for 2 years that would then be renewable. So this was really a lifeline for many immigrant youth who otherwise had no alternative to be able to really fully live their lives in the United States out of the shadows, and was a huge victory for the organizing and activism of immigrant youth and others across the country. And we saw that in the election in November of 2012, when President Obama was running against the Republican candidate Mitt Romney, that President Obama sailed to victory largely on the backs of Latino voters across the country. The president got, the lion's share of the Latino vote. And in the immediate aftermath of that election, literally that night, the next day, we saw Republican pundits, Republican elected officials, Republican, pollsters coming out and start talking about the need for Republicans and the Republican Party, Republicans in Congress, to dramatically alter the way that they approached immigration and immigration reform. Talking about the need to provide folks, undocumented folks who have been living in the United States for decades, with a realistic road to citizenship. And we saw all of that kind of discussion and debate in the Republican Party, in the ongoing debates and discussion happening within the Democratic caucus, culminate in a Senate bipartisan bill, S744, being introduced and ultimately passed in the Senate in the summer of 2013. That bill had 14 Republican votes, along with every single Democrat that voted for that bill, and had a lot of momentum to go into the House. As a reminder, the House was still controlled by Republicans. Speaker Boehner from Ohio was the Republican Speaker of the House. And unfortunately, after over a year of being under consideration and a lot of political turmoil, the bill was never even considered in that Republican-controlled House, and it died at the end of 2014. So in November of 2014, when it became very clear that Congress was not going to be able to act on that bipartisan bill, and any prospects of immigration reform were dimming quickly, the president announced the creation of a new program from the Oval Office, Deferred Actions for Parents of Americans, or DAPA. And this is a program that would have expanded the pool of people who would have been eligible to apply for deferred action or protection from deportation for 2 years and a work permit to the parents of U.S. citizen children or children with green cards. Unfortunately, a group of states led by Texas sued the administration in the Fifth Circuit, saying that the program was unlawful. The Fifth Circuit agreed with the states that brought the lawsuit. It eventually made its way to the Supreme Court, and because the Supreme Court at that point only had 8 justices, the Supreme Court tied 4-4, and so the Fifth Circuit's ruling was upheld, and the program never went into effect. So DAPA was announced, but no one was ever able to apply for that program. And then, of course, I don't need to tell all of you, and I'll wrap up quickly here. In 2015, President Trump launched his campaign, and we all remember that he launched his campaign where he made xenophobia and promoting anti-immigrant racist rhetoric and policies a cornerstone of his campaign, and ultimately would take the oath and become the president in 2017. So if we go to the next slide, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because we could do a whole multi-day lecture on just the Trump policies, but I just wanted to run through some of the worst of the Trump policies with regards to immigration and border that he was able to implement during his 4 years in office, including, of course, the infamous Muslim travel ban, which was ultimately upheld by the Supreme Court, even after being stopped and started in various iterations. Building of the border wall. He ultimately did rescind DACA, which is currently still embroiled in the courts. But what he was successful in doing was allowing no new applicants for the DACA program. And so, for many years now, there have been immigrant youth who were too young or ineligible at the time to apply for DACA under President Obama, have not been able to apply and have no protections and have no access to a work permit. We all, of course, remember the horrific family separation, which happened under zero tolerance, remain in Mexico, and all of the changes to asylum, which I bet Robin will talk about, Title 42, which under the guise of a public health emergency, a slowdown in naturalizations, gutting our refugee system, proposed changes to the public charge rule, which thankfully ultimately never went into effect, and dramatically expanding our interior enforcement. So I'm going to pause there and hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Anu. That was a crucial overview of many, many years of important immigration policy and important enforcement history, moments that have really shaped what state and federal immigration policies look like today. So now we're going to transition to a conversation about the current situation at the southern border. And Robin from Human Rights First is going to provide us some context on a few crucial current topics related to the border, including Texas and the GOP's efforts to curb border crossings, what asylum and detention has looked like for migrants post Title 42, and what kinds of mobilization efforts have formed in the face of the Senate deal. We'll also talk about what advocates propose can be done moving forward and any changes that they're looking to make. And just a reminder for the audience to pop your questions in the Q&A if you'd like as we go, so we can look at them at the end as well. All right, I'll hand it over to Robin now.
Thank you, Julia. And hi, everyone. I'm Robin with Human Rights First. So just quickly to give you some background, in case you're not familiar with our organization, Human Rights First was founded in 1978 on the principle of respect for human rights. And since our founding, we've had an in-house team that provides pro bono representation to people seeking asylum, including in New York, where we work closely with our partners such as Immigrant ARC and the New York Immigration Coalition to serve New Yorkers who are seeking asylum protection. We leverage that representation experience to then inform our advocacy on protecting access to and improving the process for those who are seeking asylum in the United States. So I'm going to focus now on what has been happening along the southern border and the situation for those who are trying to seek protection here. Much of our work for the past 6 or more years has been focused entirely on protecting access to asylum due to some of the attacks that we've experienced on that form of protection. So moving on to that next, onto this slide, I think it's really important for us to consider the impact of Texas's actions on the broader political environment that hugely impacts border and asylum policy. So since 2021, the state of Texas's racist Operation Lone Star policy, under which immigrants and border residents, including many asylum seekers, are racially targeted, prosecuted, and incarcerated for misdemeanor offenses, which they are at times lured into, has also seen the state of Texas busing migrants to northern cities, which in turn inspired other governors to do the same over the past 3 years. So I believe Ariana will be discussing what this has looked like in New York and the local response. But effectively, both along the Texas border and more broadly throughout the country, Operation Lone Star and these actions by Texas to politicize new arrivals has dominated the media narrative and also exacerbated the political situation with regards to people who are seeking asylum in this country and arriving here, as well as the safety of those who are being used as political pawns in these games. So as Anu flagged, some of the key policies that we saw under the Trump administration, we were, as we exited the Trump administration and those extreme policies, many of us had high hopes for a more positive affirmative policy agenda and vision under the Biden administration. But now that we are over halfway through, we are sadly not in a much better situation. particularly for those who are seeking to access asylum protections along the southern border. So for 2 years after taking office, President Biden kept in place the inhumane Title 42 policy that was started by the Trump administration during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this was despite a court finding that this policy was in violation of our obligations towards people seeking asylum, as well as the chaos that it caused in terms of border management. In May 2023, it was finally terminated, but instead of returning to regular processing along the southern border, the Biden administration decided to impose their circumvention of lawful pathways rule, which we refer to as the asylum ban, because of the restrictions it places on access to full asylum protection and the ways it punishes those who seek refugee protection after entering the country between ports of entry. The asylum ban disproportionately harms Latinx, Black, LGBTQ, and Indigenous asylum seekers, who, as a result of the policies included in this rule, are often stranded in Mexico to face prolonged waits. They experience discrimination as well as significant health risks due to the inadequate access to medical care and dangerous living conditions while they're waiting in Mexico. Asylum seekers are required to wait in order to access ports of entry because they need to have a CBP-1 appointment to be processed into this country. These appointments are incredibly limited in terms of the number and availability along the border. We have spoken with asylum seekers who have attempted to access the ports of entry without an appointment, who are pushed back and prevented from doing so by Mexican officials, seemingly at the behest of the US government. The asylum ban also imposes an unlawfully heightened standard for those who enter the country between ports of entry in order for them to pass their initial asylum screening interview. And if you're found to be subject to the ban, you'll be presumed ineligible for asylum protection. This rule is being litigated, and we hope that it will not be allowed to remain in place. The second key policy that has been put in place since the end of Title 42 was something called the Families and Expedited Removal Program. This program was first announced by ICE in May 2023, and it places families, so parents and children who are apprehended at the US border, into a dramatically expedited asylum screening process, and during which the family is kept under heavy surveillance. Expedited removal is a form of processing that was created in 1996 that allows the US government to summarily deport people who are arriving in the United States without ever having a chance to present their case to an immigration judge. Expedited removal has been repeatedly shown to have inherent due process obstacles that are impossible to overcome. So this process, combined with the Biden administration's asylum ban, stacks the odds against people who are seeking asylum and makes it more likely that they will be returned to danger in violation of our obligations to refugees. Nonetheless, the Biden administration has increased its reliance on expedited removal through this family program and has indicated their intention to continue to increase and expand the use of expedited removal. Recent data has revealed that through this program, less than 3% of families have been able to secure legal representation to help them navigate the complicated asylum process. Alongside these harmful policies, the Biden administration has also drastically ramped up its use of immigration jails, with over 38,000 people in immigration custody daily. The vast majority of those individuals are comprised of recently arrived migrants, many of whom will likely be seeking asylum. Due to the lack of specific data releases by ICE, there's much we don't know about this population, but what we do know for sure is that immigration jails disproportionately harm Black, LGBTQ persons and other vulnerable populations. The use of solitary confinement in particular is very concerning, as well as the prolonged and arbitrary nature of ICE jail. So alongside these harmful and concerning administrative actions, for the past several months, we faced a serious fight on the Hill, with a potential Senate bill being voted on at the start of last week and being defeated due to political divisions. This bill was the culmination of months of closed-door negotiations in the Senate, with significant support from the Biden administration to pass what would have been the most significant and anti-immigrant changes into law in exchange for short-term foreign military funding. The bill sought to enact some of the most disastrous xenophobic policies that ANU had flagged from the Trump administration, including an expulsion policy, much like Title 42, which we had previously seen many Democratic senators oppose when it was done under the Trump administration. Thankfully, these harmful policies did not survive in the Senate bill. However, we now have to contend with the political situation we find ourselves in, where Democrats showed themselves willing to potentially support massive infringements on asylum law because they viewed it as politically advantageous. Thankfully, a silver lining of all of this was the huge outpouring of support and mobilization across the country of people who were willing to oppose these trades on the lives of immigrants, including many from New York. We'll likely need to continue to work to oppose any political dealing throughout this election cycle. And in the meantime, the situation for those seeking asylum seeking to access our asylum system remains dire, with significant restrictions on access to asylum along the southern border in place, huge backlogs in the processing of cases for those who are already here or who enter the immigration system, and a large population of people who are on short-term status like parole, including many Afghans who are evacuated to this country, Ukrainians and Venezuelans who are eventually going to need action to secure permanent status. So that moves us along to our solutions. If you could move to the final slide. Given the inaction in Congress to codify humane and effective improvements to our immigration system, we continue to offer real and proven solutions to the Biden administration, including to protect people seeking safety at the US border by restoring access to asylum and maximizing and funding CBP so that they can more effectively process individuals through ports of entry, and rejecting misguided policies that would turn people back to danger or punish them for seeking protection or separate them from their families. We also urge that the administration launch and support a better coordinated humane reception system with proper funding for border as well as interior cities and communities, overseen by humanitarian specialists that could safely and quickly register people seeking protection at the border, that would reject the use of immigration jails and provide community-based support for people so that they can understand their legal rights and obligations while they wait in safety for their cases to be decided. And finally, for them to develop a more fair, effective, and timely immigration system, which would include funding to properly staff asylum adjudications, as well as immigration court hearings. Finally, provide legal counsel for immigrants who are going through the removal process, and work authorization determinations to be determined promptly so that individuals are able to provide and support themselves and their families while they wait for their cases to be heard, as well as to get rid of some of the very counterproductive inefficiencies and timelines that have been put in place in recent policies. So I think I'll leave it at there. I've covered a lot and happy to answer any questions, but hopefully this sets us up nicely to hear from Ariana about what has been happening in New York.
Thank you so much, Robin. Yeah, much of what you spoke about now has, of course, had a direct impact on the new arrivals who've made the journey through the southern border, and who we're seeing a lot of focus on since about the spring of 2021, particularly in cities like New York, Chicago, and Denver, cities that are struggling to handle this high number of migrants arriving and grappling with meeting the needs of this population. So now we'll take a more granular look at the specific situation going on in New York City. Oriana with Immigrant ARC will talk about what the organization has seen in New York since more than 170,000 asylum seekers have gone through the city care since the spring of 2021. We'll go through the efforts that Immigrant ARC is taking on to provide rapid response services to asylum seekers, especially those in city shelters. We'll also touch on topics including the busing of migrants to New York, Immigrant ARC's rapid response clinics, and what the movement to build a stable legal infrastructure for migrants has looked like in the area. I'll hand it over to you, Ariana.
Thanks, Julia. Hi, everyone. Thank you for taking your time out of your lunchtime to talk to all of us. So as Julia said, my name is Oriana Shulevitz-Rosalo. I am the policy and advocacy strategist at Immigrant ARC. Just a little more background, we're an 80-member organization that provide immigration legal services, that have members that provide immigration legal services across the state of New York. And our mission is to ensure counsel for all immigrant New Yorkers. So just to kind of get a little more granular, give you a broad overview, I'm sure a lot of you have been seeing the stories that we've been hearing, and there have been news article after news article about the folks who are arriving from our borders who are being bused. I know that Robin touched on that briefly as well. But I think want to focus on a couple of things. So it's been a year and a half, roughly it's been a year and a half since we first started receiving buses of migrants into New York City. As of February 4th of 2024, we've seen about 66,000, over 66,000 people seeking asylum. But something I just really want to ground us in is that this is not really, although we're seeing an increased number of folks seeking asylum at this moment, this is part of a much larger trend, right? New York has always been a home for immigrants. We would have in the 1900s, like for example, in 1907, we got over 11,000 immigrants in one day through Ellis Island, right? So it's just really important as we're hearing these kind of negative talking points about the folks who are arriving in New York, that this is part of a broader history that Anu kind of shared with us, right? That we have been receiving folks. It has been a part of our culture. It's been a part of the city. It's part of the United States, right? But why is it that we are kind of seeing it phrased to us as an emergency, as in a crisis? And so I want to talk about kind of what, with the arrival of folks who have come in the last couple of years seeking asylum or who have been bused from the border, are part of this kind of narrative of rapid response and constant state of emergency. And a lot of that has to do with our lack of long-term immigration infrastructure. And of course, as all of the panelists here will talk about, our very, very broken immigration system. So just to kind of get into what at least Immigrant ARC has been seeing and doing, some of our members have been doing, since we are statewide, we have members who have been working kind of at our northern border. We have been people in the city, Rochester, Albany, Buffalo. So one of the really important responses to, as folks have been arriving, is the Welcoming New York program. So this is a program that IARC partnered with the New York Immigration Coalition, which is coordinating rapid response efforts across immigrant communities, and is a part of the New York Resettlement Campaign. So basically it's creating services to immigrants throughout the state. And like I said, is part of this rapid response network, which is crucial as people are arriving, but is more of a short-term solution to a long-term resource need. So for example, we have been seeing programs upstate. So we have our rapid response clinics. We have colleagues within the Immigrant ARC who's been putting together these asylum clinics as folks have been evicted from our New York City shelters, which has been a huge issue in terms of making sure folks are getting the resources they need. We have been seeing that legal service providers are unfortunately stretched very thin in Rochester, Buffalo, and Albany, especially as migrants are being bussed up from New York City. And so to try to ensure that folks aren't falling through a cracks, we're seeing a lot of legal service providers who are conducting both temporary protected status clinics, asylum clinics. A lot of them are hybrid. And these clinics are very helpful in the sense that folks are coming in and they are doing their applications, and they are ideally, starting their process to their immigration resettlement in the United States, in New York State. But and we are seeing similar things in New York City. So in New York City, we have the city launching its New York City Asylum Application Help Center. It's also doing these pro se models. Our organization, paired with the NYC, created a work authorization clinic that I believe was about a week or so. And we were able to process about 1,700 applications. But as enormous as these rapid response efforts and as Herculean as these legal service providers have been in trying to respond to this overwhelming need, what we're really trying to learn from this is that the reason it's a state of emergency is because, for example, we we're not seeing folks who are receiving that immediate long-term legal counsel. So they might have an application that's been put in, they might go to one of these clinics, right? But unfortunately, these applications can take years to adjudicate, which means that they might have an application in, but then they have to have follow-up paperwork. They might have to move because they're inevitably going to have to move because they're going to be pushed out of the shelter system, right? So while we're seeing providers who are doing all these kinds of work to face the need that is arriving, right? The reality is that if we want to move away from kind of this emergency model, what we need is long-term infrastructure. And this can look like passing the Access to Representation Act at the state level, which is a bill that would ensure that people have a right to immigration legal providers and wraparound services. And making sure that we're putting money aside, at least at the New York State level, for about $150 million in the budget to ensure that folks have deportation defense, that our legal service providers are receiving training, are being recruited, or being retained, and that we're also providing education and integration. So basically, there's just a long summary of trying to explain that although this seems like a constant state of emergency, it has been created to be a constant state of emergency, right? Because as folks are coming in, our housing and our shelter systems already have issues that really what we're saying is we need greater resources in our housing, right? We need greater housing in general, right? We need to ensure that folks have a right to an attorney when they go to immigration court so that they can settle their case and they don't have to end up detained, or when they are detained, they can kind of they don't have to represent themselves. So yeah, that is kind of a broad overview, and I'm going to throw it back to Julia to go ahead and ask us some of our questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Oriana, and thank you to all of the panelists for such an insightful overview of what the immigration system looks like, spanning more than 20 years ago, coming full circle to what the situation is looking like right now for migrants, both at the border, but also in cities across the US like New York. So now we're going to switch into the Q&A portion of this. We have a couple questions coming in through the chat, so I can go through them and point out, who potentially might be best to answer them, but please feel free to jump in, any of the panelists. So the first question we have here is, since a small number of pro bono immigration attorneys in upstate cities versus New York have been consumed by these new arrivals, other immigrants seeking legal assistance are consistently told that these attorneys are at, quote, full capacity and can't take on any other cases. For example, we have seen what appear to be SIJS eligible youth turned away. How can this be addressed? And I believe SIJS is Special Immigrant Juvenile Status. So Oriana, do you think, I feel this could be a good question for you to answer if you can?
Yeah, and I'm seeing a couple of questions that kind of touch on this issue, which is that when we are talking about rapid response, right? Like I had just been saying, we're seeing folks are arriving and we're rapidly trying to get those services to them, right? So we are putting asylum centers, we are putting folks in shelter. And the person who asked the question is correct in that we also have folks who are already existing within our communities, immigrants who have lived here for a long period of time, who still also have immigration services needs. And the problem is that when we're not working together at the city, state, and federal level to provide these resources, it becomes an emergency because folks can't just go to an immigration lawyer. They're at the moment, right? We are seeing many immigration lawyers and many legal service providers who are extremely overburdened, right? There are not enough immigration lawyers, particularly in the upstate regions. When they are there, they have more cases than they know what they're doing to do with. And they're having a very hard time recruiting folks to come work in the immigration legal field. And that's why we need these investments in, like I said, like long-term immigration legal infrastructure. What that means is, right, we need put resources so that we are recruiting at immigration at law schools. So we're putting clinics at law schools that are for legal fellows, ensuring that folks are, coming into the immigration legal field. We're ensuring that there's wraparound services, right? So it's not just, it's for folks who are arriving, and it's for folks who are already in the state and the city. Because, when someone does an immigration application, right, folks are not doing one thing, right? They're coming in as families, right? So folks have to go to their schools. Folks have to, maybe there are different kinds of benefits needs that are kind of surrounding this case. And if you don't have that entire infrastructure, we really do need to kind of move away from the rapid response and constant emergencies that we're seeing right now. Hopefully that responded to the question.
Yeah, thank you, Ariana. I think that's a good segue into the next question, since we're talking about legal representation, about someone posted, why should migrants be given free legal representation, for whoever wants to take that.
I popped a response in the chat in writing, but I can just go through that here verbally very quickly. But just to explain, unlike in the criminal legal system, there is no right to appointed counsel for people who are facing deportation. And so as a result, we believe over 70% of people in the immigration system and removal proceedings are unrepresented. And that's more so even a higher stat for those who are facing deportation in immigration jail. So when you're thinking about the problems that raises, it's not just a due process issue and the idea of fairness for those who are being forced to defend themselves against deportation, and in some cases being separated from their families, being sent back to places where they face persecution if there's someone who's seeking asylum. But also it just also causes a lot of inefficiencies in the immigration system because it takes a lot longer. It's more complicated for someone who is not a lawyer to navigate the system by themselves. So, that's just a little bit of why I think, and Human Rights First is, in favor of people having access to counsel and for hopefully one day there to be universal representation to anyone who's being put through the immigration system. But I'll leave it there and see if anyone else wants to jump in with their views on this question.
Yeah, did any of the other panelists want to add anything to that? That was great, Robin. All right. Well, we can talk a little bit about, so the mayor's office in New York now has instituted, as we know, shelter stay limits for migrants, including 30-day limits for single migrants and 60-day limits for migrant families, which evictions, which began in January, I believe, for migrant families. We have a question here about that. One of the attendees said that their organization recently received a request for assistance on behalf of a migrant family that's been served with an eviction notice from the shelter where they're staying. Are there any other resources besides the mayor's office for them to reach out to or to assist with this? Maybe Brianna, potentially?
Yeah, we can send out some resources at the end of the panel, but I do kind of just want to touch on this point, which is, again, just showing that and it kind of goes with, why should folks have representation? What is happening when folks are getting evicted from these shelters? And I want to touch on both by saying that, folks are going to come to the United States. There has been a history of folks, of migration patterns across the continent of North America and South America. It's part of our history. And the reality is that when we don't provide these pathways for folks to just become a part of the community, that they're economically independent, it's really at a cost to all of us. So for example, when we are having folks who aren't being really provided realistic long-term housing, and this is true of both citizens and non-citizens, what happens is, let's say they are in a shelter and they do put in an application. When they are getting evicted, right? They might not know that they have to follow up with that application, which means that they might lose that application. So we are, putting all these resources to, and to ensure that folks are kind of getting half of what they need, and then their application is going to basically be rejected. And that is stopping these folks from being able to, be a part of our community, open small businesses, join the labor force, put their kids in school. It's just causing these constant by putting these barriers, it's really creating problems for all of us.
Great, thanks, Oriana. I think one question that kind of goes along with, since we're talking about legal representation, we have a question here saying that legal nonprofits seem to be too overwhelmed to hire non-lawyers who can be on the track to DOJ and BIA certification to represent clients. What can potential certified representatives do to overcome this barrier? Anyone? Yeah.
I think that might still be me, and I feel bad because I'm taking so much of the question.
Go for
it. But yeah, so this is a really good question. It's why, and if we could go back to that slide, I don't know who's in charge of the slides of the $150 million breakdown and Access to Representation Act. It's one of the reasons a lot of our organization is fighting for the Access to Representation Act and this 150 million, because they're right that there is a lack of not only immigration lawyers, but also other folks who can provide a representation or assistance in immigration court. So DOJ accreditation is one of them, but we need that funding, right? So these nonprofits to do these trainings, to ensure that they have the accreditation, we need funding from both the city and state to ensure that we are creating those new folks who are getting that accreditation. That's kind of what I mean when I say infrastructure. So that's why we think that 65 million is needed to really expand the number of people who are providing immigration services. And that's not just as an immigration lawyer, but also as DOJ accredited reps.
Great, thank you. And I think we can do one more quick question here. I don't know if this is really a quick answer to this one, but essentially for Anu, if we could please summarize what we currently know of Donald Trump's plans for immigration reform should he become president again. In a 1-minute answer might be tough, but there we go.
Yeah, truly terrifying, I think, is the short answer. We know that he's put out kind of a detailed plan. And unfortunately, I think that his 4 years in office and with Stephen Miller at his side have really given him the insight on how to even more so use the levers of the federal government, exploit the levers of the federal government to really inflict harm and terror and promote his anti-immigrant xenophobic agenda. So just a couple of things we know is that, one, he's talked about immediately re-implementing the Muslim travel ban, which we saw lead to chaos and confusion at our airports. But he's also talked about just a massive deportation ramp up at a scale I think we can't even really fathom, which could involve, the creation of camps at our borders in order to speed up the deportation of longstanding members of our communities, widespread raids across the country in, longstanding immigrant communities, at workplaces, at locations that, have historically been protected and or are part of our sensitive locations like schools or churches or hospitals. He's talked about re-implementing some of the worst of his asylum policies, including Remain in Mexico, which forced asylum seekers to wait in dangerous conditions in Mexico that Robin talked about, but also, unfortunately, something that we've even seen President Biden has talked about,
re-implementing this kind of blanket ban or undermining of the right to seek asylum through the implementation of a Title 42-like policy. He's talked about really dramatically expanding the ability of the federal government to deputize local law enforcement in order to expand the ability to carry out arrests, detentions, and deportations. So I think that's just kind of scratching the surface. You know, in his first 4 years in office, we saw that in addition to all of the like very public, you know, big policy changes, there were so many little policy changes that happened at the regulation level, at the implementation level, that dramatically impacted people's lives and their people's ability to like live safely and thrive. And so, you know, would expect those to all be reinstated and kind of turbocharged. So, you know, I think we would need to be prepared for the worst.
All right, well, thank you all so much. This was a super informative discussion. I hope that the audience also thought so. I'm sure they did. I'm going to pass it along to Leanne now for some closing thoughts. But yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, after that, I'm sure we all have a lot of closing thoughts or starting thoughts, actually, because there's just so much to consider in this space. Julia, I'll echo your thanks. Anu, Oriana, Robin, you're amazing. And Julia, you're amazing too. Thank you so much for hosting and moderating this panel. Could we just flip to the second to last slide, please? Our next steps call, one before that, please, first. Next steps and call to action. Julia, if you wouldn't mind throwing the links in the chat for everybody. These are, you can certainly screenshot this. We're happy to send out this deck as well, but just a few links here for you where we thought everybody might be interested in staying informed, joining some newsletters and or some volunteer opportunities here. And then, well, Max, could you flip to the final slide, please? Yeah, and here's some, you know, I strongly encourage everyone to follow everyone here on social media. You know, there's so much important information that are being shared by all of these groups, including IARC, you know, on a daily and weekly basis. Everybody has solid resources on their websites. So the information is there. And clearly by, you know, the huge number of panelists the huge number of attendees we had here, huge number of signups, and the tons of questions that unfortunately we probably couldn't even get to, there's such a need for this information. I know I can speak from our point of view and say we will certainly hold more of these informative panels, but in the meantime, certainly take up the information and resources found within the groups and within our speakers. And to that end, I can't believe we are ending precisely on time. That's sort of a miracle. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, panelists and other participants and our back end, Rockstar Max. Really appreciate everyone. And we will, as promised, see you again very, very soon. Take care, everybody, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.